It all started on Christmas Eve of 1945 in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. 19-year-old Marion, the oldest daughter, surprised her three younger sisters with new toys she had bought them as gifts while working at a dime store. 12-year-old Martha, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty were thrilled and eagerly asked their mother if they could stay up past their usual bedtime. At 10 p.m., the mothers, whose name was also Jenny, allowed them to stay up a bit longer on the condition that the two eldest boys still awake, 14-year-old Maurice and his 9-year-old brother Louis, remember to put the cows in the barn and feed the chickens before heading to bed themselves. George, who was the father, and the two oldest boys, 22-year-old John and 16-year-old George Jr., were already asleep. After reminding the children to do the chores, Jenny took her 3-year-old daughter Sylvia upstairs with her, and they went to bed. The telephone rang at 12:30 a.m. Jenny woke up and went downstairs to answer it. The caller was a woman whose voice she didn't recognize, asking for a name she wasn't familiar with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses in the background. Jenny told the caller she had reached the wrong number, later recalling the woman's weird laugh. She hung up and returned to bed. When Jenny entered the living room, she noticed the lights were still on and the curtains were open, tasks the children usually completed before going to bed later than their parents. Marion had fallen asleep on the living room couch, so Jenny assumed the other children who had stayed up later had gone back up to the attic where they slept. She closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and went to bed. At 1 a.m., Jenny was again awakened by the sound of an object hitting the house's roof with a loud bang, then a rolling noise. After another half hour, she woke up again, smelling smoke. When she got up, she found that the room George used for his office was on fire around the telephone line and fuse box. Jenny woke him up, and he woke up his older sons. Both parents and 4 of their children, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., escaped the house. They yelled to the children upstairs, but heard no response, and they couldn't go up there as the stairway was already in flames. In his first police interview, John said that he went up to the attic to alert his siblings sleeping there, though he later changed his story to say that he only called up there and did not actually see them. Efforts to find help were unexpectedly complicated. The phone didn't work, so Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. George attempted to climb the house's outside wall and broke open a window, cutting his arm in the process. He and his sons intended to use a ladder to the attic to rescue the other children, but it wasn't in its usual spot against the house and couldn't be found nearby. George then tried to pull both of the trucks he used in his business up to the house and use them to climb to the attic window, but neither of them would start, despite having worked perfectly the previous day. The 6 Sodders who had escaped had no choice but to watch the house burn down and collapse over the next 45 minutes. They assumed the other 5 children had perished in the blaze. The fire department, low on manpower due to the war and relying on individual firefighters to call each other, didn't respond until later that morning. Chief F.J. Morris said the next day that the already slow response was further hampered by his inability to drive the fire truck, requiring that he wait until someone who could drive was available. Morris told the Sodders that they had not found any bones, which would have been expected if the other children had been in the house as it burned. According to another account, they did find a few bone fragments and internal organs, but chose not to tell the family. Modern fire professionals have acknowledged that their search was, at best, only a superficial examination. Nevertheless, Morris believed that the 5 children unaccounted for had died in the fire, suggesting it had been hot enough to burn their bodies completely. Morris told George to leave the site undisturbed so that the state's fire marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation. However, after 4 days, George and Jenny couldn't bear the sight anymore, so he bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the site with the intention of converting it to a memorial garden for the lost children. The next day, the local coroner conducted an inquest that determined the fire was an accidental result of faulty wiring. Among the jurors was a man who had threatened George that his house would be burned down and his children destroyed in retribution for his anti-Mussolini remarks. Death certificates for the 5 children were issued on December 30th, and on January 2nd, 1946, a funeral was held. The surviving children attended, but the parents were too grief-stricken to go. Not long afterward, as they began to rebuild their lives, the Sodder family started to question all the official findings about the fire. If the fire had been caused by an electrical problem, they wondered why the family's Christmas lights had remained on throughout the fire's early stages, when the power should have gone out. Then, they found the ladder that had been missing from the side of the house on the night of the fire, at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet away. A telephone repairman told the Sodders that the house's phone line had not been burned through in the fire, as they had initially thought, but instead cut by someone who had been willing and able to climb 14 feet up the pole and reach 2 feet away from it to do so. Neighbors reported seeing a man steal a block and tackle from the property around the time of the fire, and he was later identified and arrested. He admitted to the theft and claimed he had been the one who cut the phone line, thinking it was a power line, but denied having anything to do with the fire. However, no record identifying the suspect exists, and why he would have wanted to cut any utility lines to the Sodder house while stealing the block and tackle has never been explained. To only add to the mystery, it's been said that in the months leading up to the fire, a few strange encounters took place. First, an unknown man approached George at his home looking for work. After George told him he didn't need any workers, the man looked up at the fuse box and said, "This is going to cause a fire someday." Just before Christmas, the older Sodder boys saw a suspicious car parked along Highway 21 for a few days in a row. A man inside the car was watching the Sodder children closely as they returned from school. Jenny had trouble accepting Morris's belief that all traces of the children's bodies had been burned completely in the fire. Many of the household appliances had been found, still recognizable in the ash, along with fragments of the tin roof. Jenny burned small piles of animal bones to see if they would be completely consumed, but none ever were. An employee of a local crematorium she contacted told her that human bones remain even after bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, far longer and hotter than the house fire. The Sodders' truck's failure to start was also considered. George believed they had been tampered with, perhaps by the same man who stole the block and tackle and cut the power line. Some accounts have suggested the phone call to the Sodder house might have also somehow been connected to the fire. However, investigators later located the woman who made the call, and she confirmed it had been a wrong number on her part. Further developments in early 1946 reinforced the family's belief that the children were alive somewhere. Evidence soon emerged indicating that the fire had not started in an electrical fault and was instead set deliberately. The driver of a bus that passed through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve said they saw some people throwing what they called balls of fire at the house. A few months later, when the snow had melted, Sylvia found a small, hard, dark green, rubber ball-like object in the brush nearby. Recalling his wife's report of a loud thump on the roof before the fire, George believed the cause was a pineapple grenade or some other incendiary device typically used in combat. The family later claimed that, contrary to Fire Marshal's conclusion, the fire had started on the roof, although by then there was no way to prove it. Other witnesses claimed to have seen the missing Sodder children themselves. One woman who had been watching the fire from the road said she had seen some of them peering out of a passing car while the house was burning. Another woman, at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, said she had served them breakfast the next morning and noted the presence of a car with Florida license plates in the rest stop's parking lot. The Sodders hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley to look into the case. Tinsley informed the family that Fiorenzo Gianutolo, the insurance salesman who had threatened George over his remarks, had been on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident. He also learned of rumors that despite his report to the Sodders telling them no remains had been found in the ashes, Morris had found a heart, which he later packed into a metal box and secretly buried. Morris had apparently confessed this to a local minister, who in turn confirmed it to George. George and Tinsley went up to Morris and confronted him with his news. Morris agreed to show the two where he had buried the metal box, and they dug it up. They took what they found inside the box to a local funeral director, who after examining it told them it was actually just beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. Later, even more rumors circulated around. One rumor was that Morris had afterwards admitted that the box with the liver had indeed not come from the fire originally. He had supposedly placed it there in the hope that the Sodders would find it and be satisfied that the missing children had died in the fire. Later on, George saw a magazine photo of a group of young ballet dancers in New York City, one of whom looked like his missing daughter Betty. He drove all the way to the girl's school, where his repeated demands to see the girl himself were refused. George also tried to get the Federal Bureau of Investigation to investigate what he considered to be a kidnapping. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally responded to his letters. Hoover said the matter was for local authorities to handle, but he'd help if the local authorities requested the Bureau's assistance. In August 1949, George was able to persuade Oscar Hunter, a Washington, D.C. pathologist, to supervise a new search through the dirt at the house site. After a very thorough search, artifacts including a dictionary that had belonged to the children were found along with some coins. Several small bone fragments were unearthed, determined to have been human vertebrae. The bone fragments were sent to Marshall T. Newman, a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution. They were confirmed to be lumbar vertebrae, all from the same person. The age of this individual was around 16 to 17, with the top limit of age being about 22. Given this age range, it was not very likely that these bones were from any of the 5 missing children, since the oldest, Maurice, had been 14 at the time. Newman added that the bone showed no sign of exposure to flame. He further agreed that it was very strange that those bones were the only ones found, since a wood fire of such short duration should have left full skeletons of all of the children behind. The report concluded that the vertebrae had instead most likely come from the dirt that George had used to bulldoze the site. Later, Tinsley supposedly confirmed that the bone fragments had come from a cemetery in nearby Mount Hope, but could not explain why they had been taken from there or how they came to be at the fire site. The investigation and its findings attracted national attention, and the West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings on the case in 1950. Afterwards, Governor O.K.L. Patterson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told the Sodders the case was hopeless and closed it at the state level. The FBI decided it had jurisdiction as a possible interstate kidnapping, but dropped the case after 2 years of following fruitless leads. With the end of official efforts to resolve the case, the Sodder family printed up flyers with pictures of the children, offering a $5,000 reward, which was soon doubled for information that would have settled the case for just one of them. In 1952, they put up several billboards with the same information. The family's efforts soon brought another reported sighting of the children after the fire. Ida Crutchfield, a woman who ran a hotel, claimed to have seen the children approximately a week afterwards. She stated the children had come in around midnight with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be Italian. She recalled that they left the hotel early the next morning. In 1967, George went to the Houston area to investigate another tip. A woman there had written to the family, saying that Louis had revealed his true identity to her one night after having too much to drink. She believed that he and Maurice were both living in Texas somewhere. However, George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, were unable to speak with her. Police there were able to help them find the 2 men she had indicated, but they denied being the missing sons. Paxton later said that doubts about that denial lingered in George's mind for the rest of his life. Another letter that they received that year brought the Sodders what they believed was the most credible evidence that Louis was still alive. One day, Jenny received a letter in the mail that was addressed to her, postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man of around 30 with features strongly resembling Louis', who would have been in his 30s if he had survived. On the back was written, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie," along with other writing. The family hired another private detective to go to Central City and look into it, but he never reported back to the Sodders, and they were unable to locate him afterwards. The picture nonetheless gave them hope, and they added it to the billboard. George Sodder died in 1969. Jenny and her surviving children, except John, who never talked about the night of the fire, except to say that the family should accept what happened and move on with their lives, continued to seek answers to their questions about the missing children's fate. After George's death, Jenny stayed in the family home, putting up fences around it and adding additional rooms. For the rest of her life, she wore black in mourning and tended the garden at the site of the former house. After Jenny's death in 1989, the family took the weathered, worn billboard down. The surviving Sodder children, along with their own children, continued to publicize the case and investigate leads. They, along with older Fayetteville residents, have theorized that the Sicilian Mafia was trying to extort money from George, and the children may have been taken by someone who knew about the planned arson and said they would be safe if they left the house. If the children had survived all those years and were aware that their parents and siblings survived, the family believes they may have avoided contact in order to keep them from being harmed. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest of the surviving Sodder siblings, died in 2021. All of the members of the family passed away before finding out what really happened that night. To this day, no one knows what happened, and it's a mystery that may remain one forever.